We'll explore digital forensics. Every year, there are a lot of companies that get affected by cyber attacks and specifically security breaches. So this happens in a pretty large scale, and millions of records are either stolen, exposed, or they're altered. And most of the time, the main motivation for these crimes tend to be financial. Some of the statistics are pretty staggering. Some say that there's a new attack that happens every 39 seconds. There are 300,000 new malware programs that are created every day, 20 million breached records as of March 2021. And typically it seems like email is the big culprit and the one that's responsible for most of the malware attacks. Cybersecurity is the field that's focused on preventing these type of incidents from happening. And then you have another field, which is computer forensics. Forensics is more reactionary in nature because that's what happens after the crime is actually committed or the incident has already taken place. There are different categories when you're looking at digital forensics. At a high level, most of these are related because they all have to do with computers and computer security. But if you break it down, you can see that you have computer forensics, which can be PC, laptop, or your netbook. Then you have mobile forensics, which have to do with smartphones and iPads and any of the mobile devices. Social media forensics, in order to analyze social networks. Email forensics, that's for email, malware, and so on. Then you have database forensics, which can mean that entire databases have been stolen or the records have been altered. Network forensics, which have to do with the computer networks and network security, and so on. So these are all pretty much all related, and the high-level process and concepts when it comes to forensics is pretty much the same for all of these different categories. It's actually pretty much the same terminology. So even if you're looking at crimes that are outside of computers, like murder investigation or someone breaking and entering and so on, a lot of the forensics that you might have heard, like DNA and so on, are similar, and the processes that are followed are similar even in the digital forensics side. So there might be some legal differences in terms of the criteria that's required and how stringent the rules are, and so on. The people who deal with these are the forensic specialists. So they have a unique education of both law enforcement as well as computers. Typically, they help with issues like data breaches or when there is an identity theft. There can be security issues, which can be physical or digital. You have illegal activity that can be from within the company, for example, rogue employees or disgruntled ex-employees. You also have corruption. A lot of these forensic specialists tend to be also part of law enforcement because they need that specialized training, and sometimes they are hired as consultants in order to provide with that expertise. They also help recover documents, photos, email, and other sort of evidence from different places, so they know where to look for what. Also, doing this investigation not just tries to catch the criminals, but this analysis can also help in preventing future crimes or future security breaches. Now, if you look at the process at a high level, you can see that there are multiple steps. So these steps would be similar. You might see different variations of them, but at a high level, it's pretty much you'll have an incident, then there is some sort of a preparation, there is some sort of an identification, there is gathering of the information, analysis, and then reporting. So initially you have incident, so some incident has occurred, then you're going to be looking for some sort of a preparation. So here you want to look for what kind of equipment is there, and essentially you're trying to make sure that the evidence is preserved at the crime scene. So then you want to start digging in and start looking for sources, that is where the data might be stored or what other locations or where else you might need to look for that kind of information. Then you start gathering and duplicating, So you need to gather all the information, and then you want to make sure that you duplicate the originals so that you're preserving the originals, and then you are doing any analysis on the duplicate copy. Next, you have the analysis, where you're going to actually extract the evidence from all that raw data that was collected. And then finally, you'll create summarized reports that are actually relevant for a trial or for actually processing that event in order to get some kind of a conviction or a settlement. One of the main aspects is documentation and evidence. So all the evidence that you collect may not be created equal, because some evidence is going to be much stronger than others, and some can't even be presented, and some others can be real or not, and you need to be able to prove it, and so on. So at a high level, there are a couple of different types of evidence. You have direct evidence, real evidence, documentary, and demonstrative. When it comes to direct evidence, this is typically oral testimony, and that proves that a specific fact has actually happened or not. So typically this can be an eyewitness or a statement that's given by an eyewitness. Then you have real evidence. This is typically some sort of a physical evidence or something that includes tangible objects that can prove or disprove a fact. So typically these are things that are objects that you find at the crime scene, or things that are a lot more stronger than just the direct evidence. Documentary evidence is where you have some kind of records, printouts, manuals, and that sort of more of a documented form of evidence that you're able to provide to strengthen your case. And finally, you have demonstrative evidence. This is more derived because this is more of a chart, or you build some kind of a model in order to explain what actually happened. For example, you might draw the floor plan of a certain place, and you might even build a little model, physical model, that's a lot more easier for the jury to see and understand what's actually going on. Another concept that's important when it comes to evidence is legal hold. This is more of a US legal system, but the equivalent is there in other countries as well. So legal hold typically helps to prevent the company from wiping out any of the data that might be useful for the trial. So for example, if your company is getting sued about a certain action, and you might actually know or anticipate that it's going to happen, so you just go and delete all the records and clean everything up. So a legal hold will help prevent from that sort of a thing from happening, and typically this is done through a document, through a lawyer, where you get issued a litigation hold to that organization, and that triggers legally the legal hold. So once the party actually receives that litigation or the litigation hold or the legal hold, from there onward, you're required to maintain all the potential evidence and maintain the complete set of all the data and not make any changes or delete any of that. This also includes not just the data, but also the metadata that might be affiliated or relevant for that specific scope. Legal hold can imply or can include a lot of different things. So it can be emails or office documents. So these can even be actual physical paper or just electronic data. They can be mobile phones or iPads, databases, network shares, and so on. So all of this data needs to be properly preserved and unaltered, and you want to make sure that all of this data is available and properly preserved. So there's a separate branch for this, and that's called the e-discovery process. And there are a lot of companies that actually provide tools and services for e-discovery. And the e-discovery companies or those products also have to follow certain compliance and rules, and they help in actually collecting all the data in one place and providing audit records, logs, and so on. Now you want to make sure that you follow these rules, because if you don't, then it's very easy for the other party to say that, oh, you just deleted all the relevant records, and that can affect negatively for the judgment, and the jury will take that into consideration. Now, when it comes to capturing the evidence, there are different methods and there are different processes and different types of evidence. The most common and the most useful evidence is from cameras. So this can be photos or video, and a lot of the time these kind of evidence tend to be irrefutable. They tend to have a strong influence on the jury for obvious reasons. And these days it's pretty easy for this kind of evidence to be captured because everyone has a smartphone, and your smartphone has a pretty good camera. And most of the time it's in your pocket, and it's very easy to take pictures or take video and to save that evidence. You also have different CCTVs that are installed inside and outside offices and even on the roads, and you can find dash cams and all sorts of different video. And the important thing again is that evidence had to be properly preserved. So any of the footage or any of the video that's captured, you want to make sure that it's not altered, and you want to make sure that any of the information that's captured is done properly, so you can see the relevant information like the serial numbers or the actual document numbers and so on. So once you have collected that evidence and you're presenting it to the judge and the jury, there is a different levels of admissibility of that specific evidence. So you have to follow proper procedures to make sure that the evidence is actually admissible for the trial. So there are three types of different versions of admissibility here. So you have sufficient, competent, and relevant evidence. Sufficient evidence means that the evidence is convincing, or it measures up to the certain standard without any question. Competent evidence means that it's legally qualified and it's reliable. And finally, relevant evidence means that the evidence that you're presenting has a certain bearing to that case and that matter at hand. Once you have evidence that actually meets the certain standards for admissibility, then you have to look at the different rules. There are a couple of different rules that have to do with evidence, and these rules are determined by a judge, and they decide finally whether the evidence is actually admissible or not. There are three main types of rules here. You have the best evidence rule, exclusionary, and the hearsay rule. Best evidence rule means that the courts prefer that original evidence is presented, and if you're just presenting a copy, you want to make sure that it is notarized or somehow it's been properly made authentic. But even then, it's not just always going to be automatically classified as best evidence unless you're able to provide originals. Exclusionary rules mean that even though you have direct evidence or a proper video evidence or photo evidence of some aspect of the crime, you want to make sure that it was collected properly and with a proper court order. So for example, you need to have a proper search warrant in order for you to search and collect evidence from somebody's cell phone or smartphone. So the police can't just grab somebody's phone and then force them to unlock it and then download all the photos or messages and so on. So they need to have a certain or a proper search warrant that allows them to do that, and this is part of the US Constitution, and it would be a violation of the Fourth Amendment right of the individual if you just collect evidence without a search warrant. And any of the evidence that's actually collected without a search warrant would actually not be admissible in court, and even if that's very obvious evidence that the crime was committed, it would just not be admissible, so it would be a shame. So you want to make sure that proper procedures are followed. Now this also applies to within the company employees as well. You want to make sure that the terms and conditions are properly stated in the employee handbook if you're actually snooping on the employees or if you're actually collecting evidence and so on. Digital evidence is not always considered as best evidence because it can be copied, or there are certain rules that you have to follow and prove through audits and through logs and so on to make sure that it's counted as best evidence. Finally, you have hearsay rule. So this is pretty much second-hand evidence, and this is just saying that a friend of a friend said something and using that as proof. So that's typically not allowed in court, but there are a lot of different rules against or that are exceptions to the hearsay rule. So a lot of these have to do with different states and different countries will have different exclusions and different versions of the hearsay rule, but typically in terms of the definition, it's a statement that was made outside the court which tries to assert facts, and then now it's being used in the court to prove that a certain truth or a certain fact is asserted. So these statements can be oral, written, or even non-verbal, and the computer-generated evidence is typically considered hearsay unless you have proper corroboration from a different witness, or you have proper audit logs that are within compliance and so on. So I'm not going to go through the whole list here, but these are the 24 popular hearsay exceptions typically that are known to law enforcement professionals. So you probably don't need to remember or learn all of these, but just have an idea of what the exceptions typically look like and how many there are.
For more details, check the link in the description. Learn with Whizlabs. Success certified.